Okay. Okay. Wow. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jason Rubenstein. I'm the executive director of Harvard Hillel, and it's an honor to be here with you all tonight on the eve of the new school year, the 2024-25 academic school year, and one that we as a Jewish community at Harvard, like the Jewish community around the world, the Jewish communities at every American campus, approach with both hope and also tremendous uncertainty and trepidation. And we are here to begin that journey of this year together. And I'm going to try to offer the best guidance, the best understanding of what we're seeing, what we're doing, and how we can work together individually and collectively to support the Jewish students of the present and set a bright and strong future for the Jewish students of the future in this community that we all care so deeply about. I want to begin just by thanking each of you for being here tonight. The fact that we're part of a community that the alumni who built Harvard Hillel and Rasovsky Hall in the generations before I came set the foundation for my formative experiences there. I was in the class of 2004. The people who have supported it as staff, as the board, as donors, in the 2 decades since are the reason that there is a foundation for a reality of a Jewish life nowadays. And it is our honor and our burden to carry that forward today. And we will all rise to that moment, this long moment together. I began here on June 1. I was working down I-95 at Yale's Hillel for the last 6 years, where we underwent a similarly shocking and troubling year, not just in terms of witnessing the horrors of Hamas's attack and the ongoing suffering of the hostages and anxiety for their return, but also then the eruption of anti-Semitism on college campuses and the many questions that brought into focus, brought really to the fore of our lives about what these places that we live, that we have loved, that were so formative to us, and that are so influential in students' lives and in America and the world are. What have they become? One of the questions that was submitted to me said, how did it come to this? No more and no less. So I'm going to be sharing with you all. We'll share it a few times in the chat. I hope we have a chat here in this webinar feature. If we don't, I'll just share my screen, which will work just fine. There's a PDF we will send around to everyone who's here of an outline for this evening, because I want you to be able to follow along. But basically, we're going to work in 2 main parts, and we'll take questions in between, and my colleagues, Celine and Jonathan, will help organize the conversation. But primarily, I'll make 2 kinds of major presentations with a break in the middle for clarifications. The first is going to be describing the work of Harvard Hillel to a large extent over the last academic year, certainly over the summer and what we're preparing for this fall. It's nuts and bolts, it's specific, it's detailed. And then after we discuss and clarify and expand on that, we will move into a second large section, which is zooming out, looking back, and thinking about how did it come to this? What are the cultural forces that we're facing, that we're encountering, and what will that mean for a strategy in the medium to long term? And I want to offer that as a picture, really maybe a turning point from these initial months of crisis, fear, and disorientation into a longer-term proactive strategy. And we'll conclude with an approach of what you all, as concerned parents and alumni, can do in the coming days, weeks, months, and as I hope I'll make the case, years. So I'm going to share my screen here, just make sure I have the right tab up for you all. And we will send this outline out to everyone also so that you can see it as well. Can you all see this tab clearly? Great. Okay. So as an introduction, I just want to offer this framing. So you can see the logo and the title. So we're grappling with a tectonic scale shift in Jewish life in America and here at Harvard. And I want to use this word advisedly, tectonic, because I think it's the most precise word. Where tectonic shifts on the type of earthquakes, of volcanoes, are when something that is massive and the foundation on which everything you know is built shifts violently, suddenly, terrifyingly. And then there's a sense as the dust settles, what is the new landscape you inhabit? And I think that is exactly the place that we are. And we are committed to creating a vibrant Jewish life here and now and securing a Jewish future at Harvard for generations to come. And I want to just say a word by way of framing about this tectonic, just to give you a picture of how quickly things have shifted in American Jewish life. In the spring of 2007, when I was a first year rabbinical student and a first year fellow in the Wexner Graduate Fellowship, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, one of the great, in some ways the greatest American rabbi of his generation, was a member of the faculty. There were 80 graduate students deeply involved in all areas of Jewish life from all denominations, and 20 or 25 faculty, very, very serious, dedicated people. And in the Q&A session, one of the students asked Rabbi Greenberg, Rabbi Yitz, why are my grandparents so preoccupied with anti-Semitism? And he said to them, I said, a very rabbinic answer, I'll tell you a parable. If you were 75 years old and your whole life the soup you had been served was scalding hot, and that was true for your parents and for their parents, and you'd been raised on those stories, and then one day, someone you trusted deeply said, I'll never serve you soup that's too hot again, you would still blow on the soup for the rest of your life. And we looked around the room at each other, like, that's why Rabbi Yitz is one of the greatest teachers of his generation. It was so humanizing. It helped you understand someone else's experience without necessarily endorsing it as factually accurate. But the message of that parable was that the consciousness of anti Semitism was a vestigial import from the old country. And once that generation was gone, we had sat Shiva and Shloshim for them, our Jewish consciousness would catch up to the American reality, where we have been promised by trustworthy people that anti Semitism would be gone. And I tell that story often to remember that happened in my own lifetime in 2007. And it carried the room, 100 people, all generations and dedications and varieties of Jewish life were moved. I mean, if you said something like that now, or the Tree of Life shooting, which is already 6 years ago, people would come at you, and rightly so. And the reason I want to say that is for us all to have some sympathy and grace for how big what we are figuring out as a community is, how big what we're confronting is, and how we all need to be in this together because we are in something that we thought maybe not all of us, but almost all of us thought would not be a feature of Jewish life and is now, in many ways, a prominent one. So I'll go back to the screen share. I want to frame what we're going to discuss tonight in the framework of the goals of Harvard Hillel, which are essentially threefold. One is to foster Jewish pride and joy. It's easy when we are beset by threats to lose track of what we are defending. And I want to articulate that right at the beginning. Our commitment is to enrich and sweeten and deepen Jewish students' lives and other students to the extent they're interested through the brilliance and the inspiration and the time-tested truth of Judaism, through the rhythm of time and Shabbat and holidays, through playful and prodding texts, through a practice of reading and debate, through song, through travel to Israel and Jewish diaspora communities, and through pastoral care and conversation where people matter deeply and that's made known to them. And that's the heart and soul of our work and always will be. The second piece, and we're going to talk much more about this in a webinar, please God, next month, is to nurture an awareness of Jewish connectedness, that Jewish students matter to one another, Jewish people across the world matter to one another, that we share something very profound, and that is actually enhanced by and not diminished by our diversity, sense of pluralism. And the third thing that Harvard Hillel does is to solidify the place of Judaism within Harvard, which is an institutional, administrative, financial, kind of back of the house operation, which is vital and time consuming. And we will share more about the ways that we are doing that work in these months and years ahead. So on this call, I wanted to address three areas, as I mentioned before. What Harvard Hillel right now is doing to support Jewish students and confront anti-Semitism on campus over the coming months and with an eye towards the longer term. This is the practical work. The second part is to frame, sorry, that's my 7-year-old blurred in the background tapping on the door. The second part is to frame what we're confronting on campus clearly and precisely. And I think the idea is, you'll see this is what we're trained to do as students at Harvard, is that thinking, collecting data and analyzing it can actually open some new perspectives. And the third is what parents and alumni can do. So let's jump in. Part one, what Hillel is doing. I put in here a number of links, which you'll get when we send around this PDF. That first one is to a letter I wrote back when I was the Yale Hillel rabbi to our community framing the issue. And I want to say as a very first piece that this work that we're doing is in very close collaboration with a number of partners. The ADL, Hillel International, CJP, the Combined Jewish Philanthropies, which is the Boston Federation. It's very forward thinking. The university administration really at every level, from members of the Board of Overseers to the president and the provost, and Peggy Newell, the president's chief of staff, the deans of each and every school, the capital D deans, the deans of student life, the DEI deans, the student life office in the college, contacts with the members of the Antisemitism Task Force and the Islamophobia Task Force, athletics, calendaring, campus security, all of the above. Our staff are profoundly integrated. They're the ones showing up. We are the ones showing up in all kinds of meetings. I will share much of that work. And I also want to say two provisos about that. The first is much of what is told to me, I can't share. I have to keep in confidence to be able to maintain and build these relationships. And the second is that what I'm going to share is about a third of the work that we're doing. I could have picked another list just as long as this and then thrown that out and picked yet another one. But I'm trying to give you an illustrative feel of what it's like to advocate for and to represent the Jewish community on campus right now. So there are 6 key areas of this kind of ongoing work at the university. And this is work that we partner with the university on for the simple and profound reason that Harvard is a large place. The Jewish community is a significant and organized, but ultimately small part of it. And for us to accomplish what we need for us to do right by Jewish students, we need to build a strong and effective coalition that understands the perspectives of administrators, donors, alumni, parents, professors, and on, and works with them to identify really shared goals and advance those. The first area here is neutrality and tolerance. And the key commitment here is the idea that the university is a place for the pursuit of truth, wherever that might lead, and not advocacy on a specific political issue. The university ought not to take stances. It ought to zealously guard the purity and clarity of its dedication to the expansion and transmission of knowledge. And there are some key individuals. I would say, President Garber, Provost Manning have made it 100% clear that this is their number one priority. The deans of other schools, as I've met with them, the capital D deans who run those places, are similarly inclined. They understand and will tell you that there is a minority of faculty who do not see that as their responsibility, their vision of the university, and that the responsibility of the deans is to ensure that despite internal resistance, despite internal conflict, that their view of a liberal, in the very classic sense, the Lockean sense of the university prevails. That is an ongoing, day by day, program by program work that will take a long time to reach fruition, and we are a part of that work. One example of that, and some of this might be review for people who've been following the Crimson all summer, was the work of the Institutional Voice Working Group, which articulated something very much like the older position of the University of Chicago of institutional neutrality, that the university ought not to take positions on the political issues of the day, unless they pertain specifically to the work of the university. So for example, if scholarship visas for foreign students were going to be ended, that pertains to the vital work of the university, because about a seventh of the college, and about twice that proportion of the graduate and professional schools are international students. So that would be an issue the university would speak out on. But other issues, the Ukraine war, the Sudan civil war, the presidential election, is not a thing that the university will speak on. And that if you look up the news coverage there in the full statement, you will see that that is seen as a directive not just for the university from its upper echelons, but to be implemented at every level. The ethos of it, i.e., implies that the undergraduate chess club also ought not to be making these statements, but ought to pursue chess and not be distracted by other things or allow excluding people on other areas to get in the way of their cultivation of a community around chess. The second piece of this work is, which was exciting to see Bloomberg cover on August 1st, the university asking the college specifically adding a question to the application, asking students for a time they encountered someone who sees the world differently and how that changed and expanded their thinking and worldview. And the idea here is to signal and to select for students who see the world through the lens of encountering difference and exploration rather than putting on blinkers and canceling or trying to exclude anyone who disagrees with them. A third critical area here is the work of orientation. First-year orientation had been beset by a number of moments and modules that were built around what was called social identity, and really constructed around these kind of oppressor-oppressed binaries. And those have by and large been removed in favor actually of the constructive dialogue initiative modules from Jonathan Haidt. And the last piece I want to highlight here is there's an initiative called the Intellectual Vitality Initiative. It's also IV, like institutional voice. That's the work of Provost Manning. And the idea of this here is to, again, kind of raise up initiatives of collaboration across difference and across disciplines to address difficult issues through a spirit of inquiry. And that initiative is getting off the ground. But I want to give you one picture of how that might play forward. We're all aware, right, that there's an extensive degree of academic freedom, of protections of tenure, but not just that, of the kind of independence of scholarship at a university, and that makes it very difficult to, change personnel to punish unpopular speech, and that ultimately probably is as it ought to be, and it also makes the life of protecting Jewish students and other groups from sometimes the horrific speech of faculty quite difficult. And one of the worlds you could imagine is a provostial decision that says, since the university's purpose is intellectual vitality, funding for travel, for hosting conferences, for funding lines for graduate students and postdocs would be allocated based on a unit's intellectual vitality score. So units that are contributing to scholarship, that are have a broad diversity of the scholars of their field with differing opinions, would have more funding accessible to them. Right? That's the type of solution. Will that particular thing come to pass at Harvard? Is it the right solution? I'm not sure. But it's the type of thing that once you kind of start working in the administration, you could see a path forward to a type of signaling, to a tilting of the playing field, and ultimately to like an empowerment and a protection of the types of faculty, the types of people here, the types of conversations here that will protect our students, will help them find their voice, will help them be free of discrimination of any type, including anti-Semitism. I want to pause here actually before I go on further, and I meant to articulate this really at the beginning, but I want to say it now because I imagine that many of you on this call, as am I, are concerned and uncertain about what will happen on campus this fall. And I'm seeing some of this in the chat. For example, I'll just give a few examples. At MIT, there was disinformation about Israel being handed out as flyers at orientation. At Harvard, there were actually some teach-ins from the PSC having a kind of liberation orientation. And I just heard this kind of shocking piece of news, which I haven't been able to verify myself, that at Maryland, University of Maryland, the SJP chapter reserved the campus quad on October 7th. Now, that last thing will not happen at Harvard. My colleague, Rabbi Getzel Davis, who really was a stalwart for this community over the past year, months ago reserved her Centenary Theater on October 7th for a vigil for the Jewish community, which we were co-sponsoring with Chabad, and which all of the university administration and chaplains has been invited to. And I'm saying that by way of saying that the error bars are very, very wide on the degree of protest, the type of protest, the type of engagement we will see, and also are very wide on how the administration at Harvard might respond. And those are two issues of significant concern to the Jewish community. And it's deeply challenging to be entering the time when the first year students are moving in, the bulk of them tomorrow. Classes begin next week with so little information about what will happen. And I want to be clear about that. Our staff have worked out a number of different scenarios, including working very closely with student leaders to be prepared to respond in different types of situations. Over the year, we have very open lines of communication with the administration. And also, I would give so much to know what will happen and be able to prepare specifically for that scenario. We will be in fulsome and frequent and open communication with you all about what is happening here on campus. And I know that that is unsatisfying on a deep level, but it is accurate that we cannot yet predict what the fall will bring. We are just doing everything that we can to be ready for those different situations and ultimately to be setting ourselves up for a second semester and on in a better position as a community and for the university. Okay, so we talked through number one, which is a goal of neutrality and tolerance. The idea here, in case it's not clear, is that in a longer term solution, I'll say, to this type of problem, the problems of the exclusion of Jewish and Zionist students, the problems of a vilification of the Jewish country, the Jewish national liberation movement, in a university culture where no one is vilified, where differences are seen as to be respected and queried rather than opportunities to exclude, that this and other types of discrimination will fall away. I will explain a little bit later on why I think these are so important, because I think they actually have a totally vital dimension to our work. Okay, second is education on anti-Semitism in Israel. So there is a tremendous need for anti-Semitism discrimination. People do not necessarily understand what anti-Semitism is. There are attempts to shield anti-Zionism from criticisms of anti-Semitism, which I think is misguided and even a type of gaslighting. And there's also tremendous ignorance about the history of Israel, of the modern Middle East, and of the complexity and richness that is the state of Israel. And that is a project throughout Harvard that I want to describe a bit about. And give you some examples. So one, for example, I mentioned first year orientation earlier. Here is another example. There is a unit in the first year orientation in the college on bullying and harassment, and which is a Harvard-wide policy that went into effect on September 1 of last year. And one of the examples being used for students to discuss and understand is an example of discrimination against an Israeli student. So there's not an independent standalone module on anti-Semitism, but there is a picture of this happened here. This is the kind of thing that must not happen for us to be a supportive community. A second example, which is in process, is the work to bring anti-Semitism training from within the Jewish community, ideally from Project Shema, into the college and throughout the university. The business school here is a leader, thanks to organizing efforts that go back several years by the Jewish alumni of the business school, and will hopefully be a platform for further training. Project Shema is one of the gold standards within the Jewish community. Another example, and I'm trying to give you a picture of how many knobs and levers there are to pull and flip, and how if we can do 100 things of the types of things I'm describing, this university will be a different place, a better place for its mission, a better place for its Jewish students. There is a pluralism initiative, which is a joint project of the Anti-Semitism Task Force and the Islamophobia Task Force to have difficult conversations. And I was brought into that process kind of midway and have been advocating primarily that the difficult conversations that need to be had to explain and understand the last year are not just what happened in the Middle East, but also the tradition of anti-Zionism in the American left and the connection between the anti-Israel encampments on many campuses and the surge of anti-Semitism in America since 2007 when I told that story. I don't know whether I will succeed in that effort, but I'm trying to give you a picture of how there are efforts to convene conversations. We're involved in those, and we're involved in making sure that they address the real needs of Jewish students and the Jewish community. A fourth area here is there are certain programs within the university, particularly the Religion and Public Life program in the Divinity School, and there's a program called FXB, which is the kind of social justice program at the Public Health School, where there's a kind of entrenched anti-Zionist orthodoxy, which, a significant portion of their programs are on Israel-Palestine, as they call it. Sometimes they call it just Palestine. And in all of those, as far as I can tell, not almost all, but all of them, Zionism and Israel and Zionist Jews are portrayed not just negatively, but really kind of inhumanly as evil. And I reached out to the heads of those programs. I actually met today with the deans of both of those schools. There's ongoing work. I'm not necessarily satisfied by the pace, but there is an ongoing piece of advocacy, which includes, actually, it shows an example. The dean of the Divinity School has instituted a reading group, one of the books of which is Yossi Klein Halevi's Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, for the entire Divinity School to read. That is not nothing. It's also not everything that ought to happen. And that's kind of where we are in motion with that. Similarly, two last pieces here on the educational front. There has NYU recently instituted a new code of conduct that explicitly states that Zionist is more or less a protected category, that it can't be used as a code word. You can't discriminate against Zionists and be in line with the code of conduct of the university. And similarly, there was an injunction that a judge issued against UCLA that stated, again, I think correctly, that if there are any spaces that are being provided support by the university that are excluding Jewish students because of their Zionist commitments, which are sincerely held religious, cultural, familial traditions, that those spaces actually need to be disbanded. The university cannot allow them to exist on campus. My hope is that the Harvard administration has been advocating for a finding of this type, but we have not yet seen one. And then the last thing, which I want to point out, and one of my colleagues, one of the social studies tutors, pointed this out, is that there is a tremendous void of educational resources on the modern Middle East at Harvard. There's a class, one class that's taught periodically, and that's about it. And so it is actually not possible for really any Harvard student to know most of what they know about the conflict and about Israel from Harvard. They can know it from TikTok. They might know it from a year in studying in Israel. They might know it from a class they took in high school or their families and their communities. But Harvard has not created a group of students who can say, you posted that meme about settler colonialism, but I've actually taken 5 classes on this. And I want to tell you why that's really not the best way to think about this. There's no group of students who can pull rank like that. And that has knock-on effects, as it were. So we are, to the extent we can, filling that void. We're a small staff compared to Harvard at Harvard Hillel. But there's an advocacy for the creation of a full-on, really kind of set of, balanced and serious professors and course offerings, which, again, over the course of years, would change the culture on this campus. There are 4 more areas of this. This is still the first part of what we're doing. There's discipline. This has been a major source of concern for our community. The disciplinary processes at Harvard are difficult to understand, slow, inconsistently applied from school to school. And this has been a source of consternation, especially with the encampment, the attempt really to enforce discipline that was then essentially overruled on appeal by the faculty council. And this is an area of ongoing work to make that process more transparent, more predictable, so it can act as a deterrent, and also that it can be a source of public reporting, so that there can actually be knowledge about how many incidents are being reported, how they progress, the demographics, what schools they're happening in, et cetera. This is an ongoing area of work with and within the administration. And I also want to say a word here that, as urgent as the discipline is, and particularly as a necessary means for the institution to express and reaffirm its values when those values of inquiry and tolerance and commitment to truth are challenged or violated, sometimes flagrantly, as they were this year, discipline is an extremely limited tool. And I want to just share I think the core of the reason why was articulated by Orwell when he said that a rule that is on the law books that no one cares about won't be enforced, but a rule that isn't on the books that everyone cares about will be. And at its heart, what we're encountering is a cultural problem here at Harvard. And we'll say more about that in the second half. But discipline can only get you so far. And an example, and I sent this to Dean Khurana last week and have been mentioning this as a framework for him and others to use, is the work of Anthony Appia on honor. In 2009, Appia wrote a book on how foot binding and dueling were ended. And it wasn't by outlawing them. People kept doing it. It was illegal when Burr shot Hamilton. It was when the way those practices ended is when people did them because they believed them to be honorable, and they ceased doing them when they believed them to be shameful. And that type of very deep cultural shift, some people believe, and we'll get into this more in the second segment, that what they're doing is honorable and moral in excluding Jews and Israelis and Zionists. And it's actually shameful. It's deeply dishonorable. A good expression of this was from the Power Arena bookstore in Brooklyn, where last week a talk that involved a Zionist rabbi was canceled because he's a Zionist. That staffer was immediately terminated, who made that decision, and the bookstore put out, I think, one of the best statements recently in the same saying, this is actually antithetical. This is something we'd be ashamed of. It's not just a small slip. And so that shift that we're trying to make goes much deeper. It's about hearts and minds in a shared culture. Discipline, again, has a piece of that, but it can't get you all the way there. And I think if history is any guide, discipline will be one piece of a much larger set of solutions. The fourth piece is encampments and protest on campus, which is the most visible and the most heated, most easily reported on dimension of life here. We don't know whether there will be an attempt at an encampment again or other forms of disruptive protest. I want to be completely unambiguous. I'm going to take a sip of water here. That the extent of campus protest, its intensity auditorily and its presence and in violation of rules being overnight, was profoundly disruptive of Jewish students' ability to access their education, which is the core of Title VI. It involved disruption of classes, groups walking into classes in the Science Center, involved Jewish students because of the chanting and noise in the yard, moving out first-year students into hotels for stretches of days, even as they were paying, of course, room and board to Harvard. And these things must not happen. And we are seeing that the university is struggling to articulate and hold that line, again, against significant internal resistance. And there are steps that it is difficult to figure out what exactly they mean. For example, there was a standardization of the fact-finding process in discipline processes. Okay, that may do something. There are new signs you'll see if you come to the yard, posted saying no messing with the plant life, no erecting structures, no leaving personal property here, no blocking paths. It also says that people who violate these processes may financially be on the hook for any costs of remedying them. And then it also says in the bottom in big red letters, exceptions may be granted by the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, which is of course true because the Faculty of Arts and Sciences controls the grass and sets the rules. And yet writing that on the sign seems to weaken. It seems to invite that there may be a wink, wink policy here. And I don't know the process by which it was decided to add that on the bottom. I have my guesses, but I think it expresses some of the internal conflict the university is experiencing right now. Now, I want to say one thing about these encampments, and I think that this is really important to remember, is by the end of that last academic year, the encampment was deeply unpopular among Harvard students. You can see this in the Crimson. You could see it in side chat posts where when President Garber warned the students in the encampment that there may be involuntary leave, there were extremely positive reactions on side chat posts like Garber 2024 with hundreds of upvotes, or we were all thinking it, Garber said it. And the reason I'm saying that is that I think we need to be strategic as a community about what we are doing when we engage with the encampment, our primary goal as a community is not and can't be to shut down the encampment. That's not within our purview. It's the behavior of a few dozen students and the decisions of a handful of administrators. And we would be strategically errant if we put all of our eggs, if we decided that the welfare of the Jewish community lay in their hands. That's, I think, if anything, the core intuition of Zionism, that it's a moral and historical error to place our welfare in someone else's hands. We are in a struggle for the hearts and minds, to spread the sense that Israel's a country, in many ways a heroic country, in many ways a normal country. The Jewish tradition is a rich and beautiful one, one that we ought to be proud of. And the anti-Zionism is actually a deeply ugly, and I'll get to this in the second part of this call, tradition that really ought to be treated with suspicion and probably even more than that, a type of rejection in a forceful way. And there are many ways to make that case, and they don't all involve being reactive against what a group of students is doing. Not that we will not respond, intelligently and planfully and with dignity and strength, but I think that it's very important that we remember that in kind of confronting these types of eruptions of something that so many of us on this call and in our community understand to be a kind of socially acceptable anti-Semitism and demonization of the Jewish people, that we also, even in those moments, in some sense, especially in those moments of fear and shock and outrage, need to keep our heads and our wits about us. Remember that we're playing chess and not checkers here. And I can say more about that in further calls, but I just want to frame it right now that I think that lining up the Jewish community with the sole goal of stopping encampments, the primary goal, is something of a mistake. That I'll say more about in the second section. But I want to frame that right now, that we are focused on encampments and Jewish students' experience, and we're also taking that really as the tip of the iceberg of a much broader phenomenon we're encountering right now. That it's not at all clear to me that even if there are no encampments, our work is done. And it's also not clear to me that even if there's an encampment and it's taken down, our work is done. We have a much bigger project. And that's what I want us all to be working on together. Two more pieces on this side. The securing of the place of Jewish life at Harvard. I mentioned this. We send out messages to every single hundreds of administrators around the university to make sure they're aware of the Jewish holidays, of the fact that meals at Hillel are open to all students. Shabbat dinners are free to graduate students. Our staff are available for pastoral care, and that they are engaged with us and bring their staffs over to come see what Judaism is. And they know that we have relationships with them so that when hard things come up, they know us and they trust us and they pick up the phone and they call us before they issue a statement or make a big decision. There's been a tremendous effort, which you may have seen covered in the Crimson, to bring kosher lunch, hot on-site kosher lunch, which has never existed in the history of Harvard, which happens now and is being provided at Hillel and slightly more complex configurations in Annenberg and FOHO as well, is a major step forward. There's a huge piece, and this would be its own call, about admissions and really the plummeting size of the undergraduate Jewish community, which we estimate hovers around 7%, which is probably less than half of what it was when I was a student 20 years ago. And this is an existential question, not just in terms of the number of Jewish Harvard alumni there will be in the future, but in the capacity of the community to support a vibrant, student-led, creative, compelling communal life, where there's a threshold of viability that honestly I'm concerned that we're slightly below. And there's an extensive effort working with the administration and admissions to build the case that Jewish life contributes in a vital way to the cultural matrix of Harvard, and ought to be seen in the types of contributions students make, just like theater and music, if not more so. One other concrete example, there are others that are longer term. There is now, through the great work of a group of professors, a weekly lunch being provided by the Harvard Faculty for Israel in two locations, one in the Longwood Medical Area and the other is being hosted at Harvard Hillel. And I want to just give you that picture that this is a major thing, that the Jewish community has this place that's open, that's humming with activity. Today we hosted the chaplains. and is the kind of basis for things we do throughout, securing, just in many ways, like Israel's an advocate for the Jewish diaspora. Hillel is a powerful advocate for Jewish community throughout the university. And the last thing I want to do in concluding this section here, and the second section will probably be a similar length, just so you have a sense, we'll probably wrap up right around 9:30 Eastern time, is we make it very inspiring and fun to be Jewish. Next Wednesday evening, there will be a carnival with a petting zoo in the Hillel parking lot. There's terrific swag, including Hillel umbrellas. So when the weather gets bad, you'll see those beautiful crimson haze all over campus. There are snacks and coffee all the time for students who make Hillel their home, not just religiously for their problem sets. In just about 2 weeks, we are sponsoring Shabbat for 1,000 with Chabad in a huge tent on Science Plaza. Everyone will be there. There are great onegs that we coordinate with students, the kind of Shabbat dinner after party. There's a Jewish Learning Fellowship that meets weekly, is one of the most popular things that happens, where students get to know each other and themselves through an encounter with the Jewish tradition. The tagline for this year is, "What do I do if my roommate keeps eating my peanut butter?" Right? How do you bring the kind of, it's an ethicist type question, but there are many others. Professor Sandel is coming on the 27th to Shabbat dinner and staying afterwards to facilitate a conversation between students about their religious and moral differences. As I mentioned, the large October 7th memorial will be in Tercentenary Theater. And we also support two major student travel initiatives to Israel. There's Apikoros, which you may have read about, the undergraduate a cappella group, which will be traveling to Israel in the spring for their tour, thanks to the help of this community that donated those funds. And also Trek, which is a tremendous undergraduate-led trip of over 100 students to Israel each year. And we are focused on making all of those pieces a piece of what we do, and making them a major piece of student life. So I wanted to give you that picture. And again, it's an incomplete picture. There are pieces that are sensitive and privileged that I can't share. And there's just much more than that. But the picture I want to give to you is of a group of people who are working assiduously and effectively in the highly decentralized atmosphere that is Harvard, and very high-paced, as we work for Jewish students in all of the ways that I think one could hope for in the coming months, and have been over the last years. I'm going to share my screen. There are also a tremendous set of questions. So I'm going to pause, get a sense of what those main ones are, and I will share my screen here just on this tab so you can see the main those main 6 points again, which are right here. I'll just scroll through them slowly. So the neutrality and tolerance, education on anti-Semitism in Israel, the question about discipline, encampment and protests, securing the place of Judaism at Harvard, and joyful Jewish life. So that is our day-to-day work. Okay, now you all have many questions. Great. Okay. Let me just take a second and think how to collect all of these. Okay. Sorry. I know there's a question about screen sharing. I will share it significantly. This document was meant actually to be consumed by people, and so I was hoping to share it in the chat, which we don't seem to have in this webinar format. But you will get this document, don't worry. So a couple of kind of specific questions. Someone asked about the presidential election, where the temperature on campus will likely be high. Again, I mean, this summer has showed us that the presidential election is very hard to predict. And not just, Nate Silver was saying 53-47 likelihood, but, in terms of the assassination attempt against President Trump, the debate, and the dropping out of President Biden, it's very hard to know what will happen. I think there will be a fraught atmosphere, and it is also entirely possible that the focus, the spotlight, the heat will move away from Israel and Judaism and Zionism, which would be, to my mind, actually quite welcome. There are a couple people have mentioned, and this is important. I will flag this. If you haven't heard about it, you should definitely know about it. On the 22nd of September, that's a Sunday, the HJA, the Harvard Jewish Alumni Association, is hosting a large gathering on campus for alumni. A tremendous amount of work and has gone into it. Einat Wilf and Dara Horn and Elon Levy, who is the Israeli spokesperson in the, Great Britain. And just breaking news, Ambassador Lipstadt, the ambassador to combat anti-Semitism, will all be speaking at the event. Harvard Hill is a co-sponsor. There will be a bagel brunch in the morning and perhaps a VIP reception in the evening. And to the extent you want to come and see campus, connect with fellow Jewish alumni and current Jewish students, it's a very powerful opportunity to do so. I want to share just one last piece on this, that we need your help to do the work I listed effectively. That the university is an integrated ecosystem, and alumni and parents and supporters have an important place in it. They're not outsiders, as some people have tried to say. And there are also like more and less strategic, more and less effective ways to be involved. And so to the extent that you want to support this work, there are ways to do that, and we'll share more in about half an hour or so about how to do that. But I wanted to let you know that. And there's a question, which again, I'm going to actually defer until another session, which is the place of Jewish students who are, filled with angst and pain about the state of Israel, who do not identify as Zionists, who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. Those students are numerous at Harvard as they are elsewhere, as among that demographic, and particularly at elite universities and institutions. And the question of pluralism there is a very profound one, of what it means to be open and also have values. And we're going to say some about that now, but I also just want to defer that question in all its difficulty, all of its intensity is being lived by Jewish students, and you can read about this in the Crimson over the course of the year, is one that is not lost on our staff, that we engage in deep, deep empathy and principle on. And it's a major piece of Jewish life right now. It is possible, though very difficult, to actually hold and heal a Jewish community with all of our differences. That will be the topic of the late September webinar. I want to pivot now to something that's much more abstract, not abstract, much longer view of what we are encountering, of the meaning and the sources, really, of this eruption of anti-Israel animus on campus. And I want to do that in a couple ways, and I want to do it in the service not just for the sake of theory, but for the sake of helping orient our community to what we're seeing, what we're confronting, and what our most plausible and hopeful path forward is, in my opinion. This is an estimation I've come to over a number of years, primarily through my work at Yale. It's a little hot down here, but has been reinforced. It may change, by a subsequent conversation, by something someone will say, but it is our working theory for what we have before us. So, were it the case that what we're encountering is just at Harvard or just at universities and just since October 7th, and sadly, that's not true. And I just want to give a picture of how it extends back in time, this real animus towards Israel, a conflation of it with an evil that ought not to be given any quarter. That's what we're facing. That's what we're seeing. More precisely, even, a sense that a place, a community, an institution is rendered good, is rendered legitimate by having no connection to Israel and by having within its ranks no Zionists. That is what we are confronting. That is an idea with a history. The first thing I think we need to confront is that it didn't just happen at Harvard after October 7th. It goes back further in time at Harvard, and it goes much broader. So to give you some examples, and I'll use a few Yale examples here also, so that's where my data are from, and everything we know indicates that this is a broader phenomenon, which has much more similarity than difference between campuses. If you go back to 2022, when the Crimson op-ed board voted to endorse BDS, Gemma Schneider, who was an editor at the time, penned a well-argued and well-documented dissent, saying we know what this is. This is Soviet-style anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism that has taken over Harvard, and I'm disappointed in my peers for following it. If you go further back to a story that I learned after October 7th at Yale, but that happened before, and this is in some ways is my paradigmatic example. There's a first-year student in a biology lab was being mentored by an older, more experienced student, and they were chatting while an experiment was running. The older student says, "Oh, what are you taking?" The younger student says, "Oh, I'm taking a class including a language." The older student says, "Oh, I love languages. What language?" And the younger student says, "Modern Hebrew." And the older student's face falls, and she doesn't make herself available for mentorship anymore. And this tragic story, right, of the basic work of the university, of mentoring, of teaching, of bringing someone into the communal pursuit of knowledge, is abrogated in effort by a sense that someone should keep it pure, a lab pure, their own social context pure, should lend no support to Zionists, is as clear an example I can give of the failings of the culture of elite American higher education. And this is the second piece, really elite American society intellectually in many ways. And you could pick examples. There's been the conflict at Penn America. It was the example last year when Harvard Chabad brought Yishai Ribo to a concert at a venue off campus in Cambridge, and the staff boycotted. You can read about this in the Crimson. And there was a quote in the article. I mean, one of the most grotesque things I've read coming from modern day America, where a local musician said, I used to love performing at that place, but I can't perform there anymore. It's been polluted now. Because an Israeli musician performed there. And the reason I'm trying to give you this type of account here is the picture of what we're seeing is much larger than this Harvard administrator did this, or they selected this person instead of that person for this role, or this policy was done under that president. We're encountering kind of a historical scale force. And we're encountering it at Harvard right now, but it's elsewhere. And I want us to understand the shape of that so we know how to deal with it. So this discrimination, and now I'm going to give you examples, specifically from Harvard, like this discrimination, because that's what it is. It's not an intellectual position. It's not a critique of Zionism. It's a position, a commitment to a social practice of exclusion, is also alive and well, sad to say, at Harvard. And the clearest example was an event that HOOP, which stands for Harvard Out of Occupied Palestine, an unrecognized group that uses Harvard despite not having permission and organizes events in the yard, again, without permission, had an event called Zionists Aren't Welcome Here. And I think that sums up the goals and the tactics. And this picture is hard to hear, but I think it's important. I'll just share one other example from someone I knew who counseled graduate students at Yale. A student was in a conflict with another student and was afraid. She said, this other student is vindictive, and I'm afraid she'll start a rumor about me that would be devastating to my social life, like that I'm a Zionist. And I mean, it hurts the heart to understand that this is the world in which Jewish students are living. And we all need to see and feel that, and to think then, well, what is it going to take, right? The world of that student with their rumors, the world of the biology lab, that kind of the idea that a group of students would be proud to be affiliated with the group that says Zionists aren't welcome here. That's a deep cultural, moral, intellectual problem, which discipline might help set some parameters for, but is not going to address. And we need to think about how this came to pass and how we might address it. And now I'm going to say one thing which will just raise the stakes somewhat, but I think, again, clarify, in that there's a reason that so many of us, I think, are reaching back to parallels of 1930s Germany, of the universities being blocked, and not, and I think this is significant, not to the kind of history of a more genteel anti-Semitism at these universities. And I think there's actually a very distinct and good reason for that, which is that at these universities, right, in the 50s or the 60s, if you listen to, for example, Stephen Rockefeller on the Gatecrashers podcast describing why the eating clubs at Princeton in the 50s or 60s didn't want too many Jews, he wasn't proud of that. He didn't think there was a moral argument for it. But what these students are doing when they say Zionists aren't welcome here, or they, refuse at Yale at the Women's Center, there was an effort both while refusing to collaborate with the Yale Friends of Israel for an event on Hamas's use of sexual violence, we're organizing a conference called Pinkwashing in Palestine. There's a sense that these students believe that what they're doing is deeply moral, is morally necessary, use those words even, and that sense of a moral urgency to the exclusion and shunning of Jews is terrifying and is new to us in America. And that's why we're reaching for these other and very dark examples and precedents. And I wanted to just frame that because there's a sense of, are we talking about another chapter in anti-Semitism in elite American higher education? And I think we're talking about a very different type of chapter. Now, there's a type of argument that's made on the left, certain circles in the left in general, and I've heard it here at Harvard, and I want to address it really forcefully here. And it's the argument that anti-Zionism is mistakenly called anti-Semitism, conflated with anti-Semitism, and we know that anti-Zionism can't be a type of anti-Semitism because there are Jewish non-Zionists and critics of Zionism. And that argument is bogus, to put it mildly, and I want to pick it apart with and for you all here. And this is the argument I've been making to the heads of the religion and public life program and to their deans and in circulating on campus. The easiest way to see the fallacious nature of that position, the insincere position, the unserious nature of that position, is to compare it with Catholicism. Right? Discrimination, one could say, well, discrimination against Catholics, which is a very long-standing tradition in America, right? Chevy Chase Country Club that I grew up across the street from denied RFK's application to be a member while he was Attorney General because he was Catholic. Discrimination against Catholics, one could say, on the style of this argument, it can't be anti-Christian because plenty of Christians aren't Catholics. After all, they fought the Reformation. But the critical thing is that for Catholics, they understand the essence of Christianity to be Catholicism. And discrimination against them is discrimination against them as a religious group. So too, for Jews who are Zionists, which is the vast majority of American Jews, and certainly of Jewry worldwide, we understand Zionism to be a core part of our Jewish identity. And therefore, we're being discriminated against on basis of our religious existence. Now, I want to carry this a step forward. By making a distinction between what you might call being non-Zionist and anti-Zionist. So let's go back to our Christian example, the Catholic example. One is totally entitled to be a non-Catholic. It could be a Lutheran or a Methodist or an Episcopalian, Eastern Orthodox. But one ought not to be anti-Catholic. You should not only, in addition to being a non-Catholic, you should say, and yet I'm committed to the right of my Catholic neighbors to pursue their religious life, to pursue a full flourishing life, to not face any discrimination. So too, I think Jews and others who are not Zionists, which people are free to have whatever political orientations they want, whatever religious orientations they want, ought to, no less than Jews who are, defend the right of their fellow Jews, their neighbors, their fellow Harvard students, fellow Americans, to live without any type of discrimination. And in biology labs, in societies, and elsewhere. And I just want to articulate that position because we are seeing this attempt to insulate, and I want to say this as scary way, justify discrimination against Zionists by trying to shield it from the criticism of anti-Semitism. And I think we can address this through tools like the IHRA definition that says anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. There is another path also, which is like, let's leave that argument to the side for a moment. It's actually religiously indefensible discrimination, even on its face. And this is exactly the position that the court took in the UCLA injunction. One more piece I want to just articulate here is that this non versus anti-Zionist have opposite antonyms, right? The opposite of a non-Zionist is a Zionist. The opposite of an anti-Zionist is someone who's tolerant. We do not, I don't believe, Harvard Hillel does not believe, I think we as Harvard's Jewish community ought not to advocate for a university where everyone is Zionists. It's a free place that should have diversity. But we ought to advocate for a university where everyone is tolerant. There can be non-Zionists, but anti-Zionist people will try to wield whatever power they have on committees, leading clubs, socially, to exclude and discriminate against Jewish students because of their sincerely held beliefs. ought not to be granted the resources and prestige of Harvard's name. And it pains me that these are the things that we have to think about and consider. These are the types of arguments we have to make, and yet we do. So I first encountered this type of ugliness in 2021, during the last war, the much smaller war between Israel and Hamas. And at Yale, there was a very ugly statement generated by Yaleys for Palestine. And it was a kind of wall-to-wall condemnation of Israel. And when we send the document around, it includes a link to it. And it included, that Israel was guilty of Western imperialism and settler colonialism, genocide, actually, even in 2021, which is interesting to look back on, and see that claim actually is independent of any casualty numbers coming out of Gaza. It's a pretext, more or less. There was discrimination against Black and brown people. Obviously, the majority of Israel's population is actually not European, on the Jewish side, just. And a direct line from Derek Chauvin, George Floyd's murderer, to every member of the IDF. It was really disgusting stuff. And this was endorsed by many dozens of undergraduate groups, including the Yale College Council. And it was seeing really for the first time, and I grew up in a liberal household. My parents met at the Brookings Institute. I was taught to adore and even worship these institutions, and had to confront an ugliness that was there on an anti-Semitism of the left, which I, over the course of the last few years, have made a major area of my own study. And the thing that was the kind of intellectual problem of these last few years was that in understanding that really grotesque caricature, that demonization in a pure sense of Israel, right? Of really treating it as demonic, an incarnation of evil on the face of the earth. The line that I kept coming back to was from Professor John Levinson, the Harvard Divinity School, an early essay he wrote in the 80s called, "Is There an Old Testament Counterpart to New Testament Anti-Semitism?" And in that essay, Levinson gives a characterization of Christian anti-Judaism, which is different than anti-Semitism. In fact, Rudolf Bultmann, great 20th century Protestant theologian, was a fierce and courageous opponent of German anti-Semitism. He stood up against the Aryan paragraph. He stood up to defend the right of his Jewish colleagues to keep teaching universities. And Bultmann gave a horrifically ugly picture of Judaism. And Levinson's line was that on Bultmann's picture, the collective projects of the Jewish people, be they Talmudic religion or the God of the Old Testament, are so morally bankrupt and spiritually backwards that any person who has affection, much less loyalty to them, deserves our pity, loathing, or fear, and perhaps all three. And one is entitled to doubts about whether they're a full member of Homo sapiens. And it was in that characterization of a third century Christian phenomenon, first century even, that I found the clearest analog to what I was seeing before myself in this kind of neo-Marxian 2021 Yale moment, and have seen on social media and elsewhere over this past year. And that is a strange thing in the history of ideas, that there's such a correlation, such a tight fit between those two. And now I want to try to offer an account of how and why we got there, which will solve another problem. Why are people so into this oppressor-oppressed dichotomy? Why can't they hold it alongside other things? One of my mentors at Yale said, why can't very smart people hold two ideas at once on this topic? So Levinson's account of that early Christian anti-Judaism is that it deals with an Oedipal anxiety, that the early church, its whole existence, is justified on it being different and better than Judaism. But it's uncomfortably close to Judaism. And so the way that it tries to throw off, or in Freud's image, kill the father, is by castigating it and casting it as this irredeemable, dark thing. It still doesn't explain. So As I would hope anyone who concentrated in social studies did and was a rabbi of a community after October 7th at one of these colleges, I got down my copy of Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies. And Popper, at the end of the intro, because that's what I felt like we were seeing. We were seeing as the year went on, it was increasingly clear that this wasn't actually a fight over Israel versus Hamas. What was happening on campus was a fight about the nature of the university. Is this a place of the hard left, the anti-Zionist left, or is it a place for all of its people, including Jews and Zionists? Is it a liberal place in the classic sense again? And Popper, at the end of the intro, great philosopher, right? The great philosopher, in some ways, the great 20th century philosopher of democracy, says, that the concept of the chosen people, there's this group that kind of moves through history as its protagonists or heroes, has two modern secular descendants. On the right, there's a racialized Aryanism, right? The master race is the chosen people. And on the left, there's the Marxist concept of the oppressed, that the oppressed are the chosen people. And I remember saying, I almost dropped the book on the floor, that what I was seeing, if you put Popper and Levinson together, Levinson is making a type of prediction. Actually, it was Popper's philosophy of science that says, a theory is tested by its predictions. That's the heart of science. Levinson makes a type of prediction that whenever a group is assuming or trying to wrest away from the Jews the mantle of the chosen people, an anti-Judaism will erupt as a way of dealing with the violence they're trying to do to our narrative. Our first example of that is the early Christianity. And then in the 20th century, the two most powerful and devastating examples of it are the right-wing racialized Aryanism and Hitler's anti-Judaism, and Stalin, and now as we're seeing it on the rest of the left, the Bolshevik anti-Judaism. And so at its heart, what I'm suggesting is that the oppressor-oppressed category that we see students and faculty putting forward is at its heart a theological category. It isn't amenable to critique. It's doing the things that a religious belief does. And it's claiming the title of the chosen people, not for the Jews, but for the oppressed. And that is an idea which we need to confront. It's not just an idea, it's a practice, it's a social tradition. And it's one that is resurgent nowadays. And it's one that, I'm trying to give you a picture of what we're seeing here so we know how to deal with it. And now I want to offer something that's slightly more prescriptive, but it'll require one more kind of excursus. So in understanding the world precisely between that kind of the fascism and the hard left, the piece that I think back to most nowadays is a piece that I read in 2017 in the Washington Post, and I can't find any longer. And it's a write-up by a political commentator of a scuffle between Trump and the Squad. And this commentator is writing, she's saying, I've been writing on politics for 35 years. I've never seen anything like this. What is going on? And her analysis is, Trump is and Biden are the oldest generation of American politicians, and that generation is the first that didn't lose any friends on the battlefields of Europe in World War II fighting the Nazis. And the Squad is the youngest generation of American politicians, which means they're the first who can't remember the horrors of Soviet communism. And so this piece's articulation was that for 2 generations, we had guardrails on American politics. On the right, no fascism. On the left, no communism. And those guardrails are gone. And what you're seeing is political figures start to explore that territory and kind of engage in this ugly and scary combat. And we as the Jews are caught in the middle of that because in the 20th century, the 2 most dangerous forces that killed more Jews and did more harm to Judaism than any others were fascism and communism. And the picture I'm trying to give here is of a world in which the liberalism, which did so much for the Jewish community, and which the American Jewish community had done so much for, and not just the American one, also the European Jewish community, is facing challenges from within. Frank Foer was very clear, and I think absolutely correct about this in his long piece in The Atlantic this spring on the end of the golden age of American Judaism. And if you read, and again, the document has a link to this, a piece in the Boston Globe 2 weeks ago about some of these kind of summer programs that are pro-Palestinian. The reporter interviews students who say, actually, the heart of this is socialism for me. And there's a statistic that young people view socialism more favorably than capitalism nowadays. And that is the world we're inhabiting. And I think basically what we're seeing on these campuses is a resurgence aided by some, I think, fairly sophisticated and well-resourced Iranian and Russian support, but a resurgence of this type of hard left plausibility. And Israel is a kind of, I don't want to say stand-in, but a kind of marker of one's devotion and correctness in this movement. A great example of that, by which I mean a horrific example of that, is the February cartoon that Hoop and Faculty for Justice in Palestine at Harvard posted, which is a grotesquely anti-Semitic cartoon. I won't even reproduce or describe it here. That cartoon first appeared in America in the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's 1967 magazine. It was a Soviet piece before that. And again, this is this kind of fairly stable tradition, which is just being rehashed here. And that's why it's so repetitive. And here's where all of that lands. There's a lot of implications, but the one I most want to draw out for all of us to think about is most of the students who are anti-Zionist at Harvard or involved in these encampments arrive at their views on Zionism and Judaism in Israel via syllogism. All good people are progressives. All progressives are anti-Zionist. Therefore, I am anti-Zionist. And this helps you understand better those videos of, reporters saying to people who are chanting from the river to the sea, which river and which sea, and they don't know. Because you and I can know that E equals mc squared, but we might not know what m means. But we know it because our physics professors told us so, because it was written in the textbook that was assigned to us in junior year, and we're part of a kind of a community of knowledge, or in the case of Israel, knowledge. And the reason that this is so significant is that to the extent you succeed in convincing a student that the picture, or a faculty member for that matter, that the picture they have of Israel and of Zionism and of the history of this idea, the history of the Jewish people, the history of this piece of land, the reality on the ground for Israelis and Jews and Arabs and like Jews, Mizrahi Jews is radically different than what they've been told. To the extent that you succeed, you will endanger an epistemic and identity level crisis. Because then the question, well, what does this mean that the people who taught me these things in the books I read didn't know this or knew it and withheld it from me? And that is a difficult thing to face. And this is precisely why the restoration of that classically liberal sense, the pursuit of truth, wherever it leads, the sense of tolerating difference and defending others' rights to exist is so critical. That's why the 1636 Forum's work is so vital. It's why I highlighted right at the beginning the neutrality piece. And I want to give you one example. It's a sadly timely example. In the late summer of 1972, the last attempted public act by Abraham Joshua Heschel was to circulate a public letter in the anti-Vietnam War community condemning the massacre of Israeli athletes and trainers in Munich. And Heschel wrote the letter and he circulated, and he had spent a decade working in this group to strengthen it, to lend it religious credibility, to advance its cause. And it attained so few signatures that he decided never to publish it. It would have been an embarrassment. 1972. And according to his student and biographer, Fritz Rothschild, this was a source of great distress to him in the last months of his life. He passed away not long after. So recently I learned that Heschel was facing up against Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre had published a piece around the same time in a Maoist periodical glorifying what the terrorists did, and arguing that in his ideal Maoist world, there would be social consensus which would be manufactured by periodic purges. I mean, these are the most grotesque images. This is the Gulag, but in Paris in 1972, and in Munich in 1972, happening to Jews, not just in theory. And I want to tell you this story on the one hand, to clarify what we're seeing, what we're dealing with, what we're confronting. And there's something that's very um, dispiriting about seeing that this isn't just a sudden eruption. There's a current which runs through, which is sometimes stronger and sometimes weaker, sometimes makes an assertion or a play to control institutions, and sometimes is pushed back by the forces of enlightenment and liberalism. And on the other hand, we stand on the shoulders of those who have come before us and have done this work. And I want us to know that, right, the UN repealed its declaration that Zionism is racism. The world looks back, not as Sartre does, but actually as Heschel did, with horror on the massacre of the Israeli trainers and athletes. And I think there's a strong likelihood, and certainly the one that we're working for, that similarly in this moment, this kind of powerful social force, which is abetted and celebrated by the illiberal societies, we will look back on it as actually a moment of galvanizing a set of clear and shared values, which in addition to securing the welfare and freedom of Americans, have secured the welfare and freedom of American Jews for generations. So I wanted to clarify that because I think it frames what we're seeing, not just at Harvard again, but beyond. And it also indicates that, well, in the short term, we need to work on anti-Semitism and education and Israel education. Those are vital needs. The longer term solution is actually a kind of a bank shot off of these questions of liberalism and shame and pride, indifference and diversity. And to the extent that we can make that claim and make that real institutionally in the university, through working together in a way that won't happen overnight. There's no single switch that can be flipped. We will have set the foundation for more flourishing generations at Harvard of Jewish life. So I've said a lot of things here in this room. I want to pause now, even though the hour is late, and just take some questions and reactions here before we get into this question of what parents and alumni can do. So I'm going to pull up the questions here so that I can see them all here. Okay. Okay. There was a question about the anti-Semitism task force, and I want to say a little bit about that. Oh gosh, one second. Okay, wow, many questions, a lot of strong thoughts and feelings. Yes. Okay. Okay. Great. So, okay, well, there's one question which we need to address just because of its urgency. The question: what if there's violence, God forbid, against Jewish students, against Jewish institutions, against Hillel or Chabad? Will there be a police-style presence? So there's Harvard University Police. There's the Cambridge Police. We work and communicate closely with them. Fervent hope and prayers that there will be no violence. And if there is, that they will protect our students and keep them safe. And I do want to say, as hard as it is to say these words, there were times that this came up at Columbia, it came up at Harvard, as I mentioned, with the students who moved off campus. It came up at Yale for some students who moved off campus. That part of our responsibility towards our students is, to the extent that they've determined that they aren't safe on campus and that the university can't, and our advocacy falls short, which is a possibility, to help them find safety. The Jewish community has been incredibly warm and supportive on that point, and guiding them through that process is a heartbreaking but urgent one for our staff, and they've turned to us. And I hope they will never have to do so again. There was one other question about the task force and its history. So it's very fraught, and there's conflict. I was not in the room for many of these conversations. I'm not in a position to adjudicate, which claims or versions are right. I can tell you what I hear from certain members of the Harvard administration, and which I hope is sincere and correct, and that they will give us cause, looking back on this because of their subsequent actions, to judge this favorably. So early on, there was a working group on anti-Semitism that was convened. Very quickly, it included luminaries, Dara Horn, David Wolpe, and made a series of far-reaching recommendations. And then those recommendations were not implemented, and the working group handed off to a task force, which has been operating much more slowly, although its report should come out in the coming, please God, in the coming month. I know their goal is to have it before Rosh Hashanah. And this process looked, a student described it as Kafka-esque, right? Is what is happening here. So the best case scenario, which again, I cannot say is the correct scenario, I'm also not sure is not correct, is that the working group's recommendations, which we now have access to from the congressional record, were far-reaching. We're far-reaching in the university. We know that that's true in terms of culture, in terms of faculty discipline, in terms of use of university resources, in terms of centralizing a reporting process. And the administration believed that they did not yet have the capital to implement these, to have buy-in, to have made the case that the problem is of the scale that these experts who were mostly not Harvard employees and had not spent much time on campus, had not systematically kind of surveyed the campus and shared their results, that they would have enough purchase to actually carry the day and set something stable that would become ingrained in Harvard's culture and actually shape it for the better. And their decision was saying, well, this is more or less directionally where we need to end up, but we now need to set up a much heavier process that will build legitimacy for this case, make the case that this is the correct and only path forward. And that will take time. It will take resources that are here in the university. It will take a listening tour to over 500 Jewish students. It will take a detailed, voluminous report, which they I believe they're working on. And though that work will then set in place the possibility of then starting to make these changes happen. I hope that that is correct. And we're going to do everything we can to make that be the scenario that transpires. I want to say one other word on this, which is, again, a kind of cautionary word of hope. So for people who are following this, Stanford has had a kind of very, very difficult turn with the publication of its twin task forces, which is the structure that most of these universities have taken up, where the Antisemitism task force advanced a call for civil discourse, as I've been making on this call, and the Islamophobia task force actually put out a report with a couple dozen pages attacking the idea of civil discourse, which puts the university in a very difficult position because what they need to do to preserve their status as a university is to pick one task force over the other. And that is the goal, was really to not be stuck in that situation. From everything I can see, that is not the direction Harvard is going. The Anti-Semitism Task Force will produce a piece about needing to introduce the values of civility and tolerance of difference. And the most senior member of the Anti-Islamophobia Task Force, Ali Hassani, was a kind of mild-mannered and moderate man, and was critically a member of the 2018 group that included Professor Danielle Allen, and actually criticized the idea of DEI as a way to approach diversity in the university, in favor of a kind of a robust, inclusive pluralism. Professor Hassani would say, speaking on behalf of himself and the task force, we believe that these binary categories of oppressor and oppressed are just wrong-headed and destructive, and we need to get outside of them. Now, Professor Hassani actually had a terrible heart attack a few weeks ago, and we're praying for his speedy and full recovery. And for his own sake, primarily as a great scholar and citizen of the university, and also for the work that he's doing in terms of healing the culture here. My hope is, first and foremost, obviously, that he'll recover and be well. And then in the vein that I've been speaking here, that the university actually will come to a consensus position, not that there won't be people who disagree, but that they won't have any institutional support, that there's a clear nearly universal position that a return to a civil discourse of cross-difference rather than reified categories of oppressor and oppressive will be the marching orders going forward and make good on the types of change that we so urgently need to see. So I want to, okay, so one more question. Question, what about Zionist students who are critical of Israel's action in Gaza? How is Hillel reaching them? Do they have a Jewish home on campus? So we work closely with many different student groups. I will just share there are two main Israel groups under the Hillel umbrella. There's the Harvard Israel Initiative, and there is a J Street U chapter. And again, I will say more on this, but we support them both with staff time and financial resources and other things. And again, that actually Professor Sandell, who I mentioned, is coming to facilitate a conversation, facilitated an event shortly after October 7th at Harvard Hillel, bringing students into dialogue about the difficult choices, impossible choices that Israel faced and faces, and how they would navigate through them. And that kind of encounter of sincere Jewish students who differ deeply, and are committed to one another's right to exist, to have their ideas, to have support of the Jewish community, but at the end of the day, will support one another rather than ever joining in a cause that says Zionist not welcome or any other type of Jew not welcome here. That's our core commitment. Okay. In our last 5 minutes here, I promised some opportunities, and I will share my screen here, and we will send this document around more fully. I promise some opportunities. What can we do? So I offer five, really four, and then a teaser for next month. What can parents and alumni do? So I think I've given these titles. Emotionally, we are dealing with a challenge that is unlike anything we've seen, and it is hard to strike the right balance. We should not be cold and indifferent to what is happening. It is galling. It is not worthy of a place like Harvard or a place like America. It is not the kind of thing any person or any Jew should face. And a white hot anger that burns quickly and exhausts itself and just seeks catharsis will not be adequate to the moment. We need a slow burn here. We need, as sometimes people in social movements talk about, moving from rage to outrage. So we need to be moderated in our level to not overplay the significance of events and not to underplay them, to not pretend that a certain event is the final chapter, but also not to give up on getting the best possible outcome we can step by step. And that is demanding work. And it's one where people in our community do and will disagree about what the right calibration is. But I wanted to frame that as the tightrope that we're all walking to. Interpersonally, please, like, be kind and gracious and curious. Writing people off, vilifying them, diagnosing them as part of the problem makes it very hard to get anything done. It weakens our community. It makes it harder for us to speak as one voice. It means that when we move past all this, we will be more isolated and more fragmented and less trusting of each other. And it's not going to build us friends. So this is hard also when you're angry, when you're disappointed, when you feel betrayed or ashamed. But it's all the more important in those situations. Last one is communally. We believe deeply in the power of Jewish community, and to the extent we found that Jews are connected to each other, they can share stories, they can share experiences, they can find people who empathize and just get it. Things are easier. Those first two pieces are easier. Metabolizing what we're seeing, figuring out how to act intelligently and strategically becomes easier. So build community, reach out to those old college friends. The last piece is institutionally. Hillel needs your help and your friends' help. The work that I've described over this call doesn't happen quickly. It takes planning, it takes trust building, it takes having great people who you invest in and mentor it and build something together with. And it's expensive. Our fundraising, to the extent it grows, will allow us to send more students to Israel, to pursue a set of programs that we can't right now, to make our building more functional and hospitable for the Jewish community, and on and on. So I'd say there's financial help, there's engagement with getting our message out. If you're interested in this and have questions, please you can send me an email. You can send my colleague Celine Ginsberg, our Director of Development, an email. We have ways for you to be involved and help to build this community. And the last piece is basically a month from now on, I believe it's Sunday the 29th, we have as a tentative date, and we will block off an hour and a half for that one. We are planning a second call where I want to, again, break it into two segments like this one. The first will be a really kind of deep dive into User's Guide to the University, how Harvard works. An example of that, just to, as a teaser, Larry Bacow, former president, shared with me that the president of Harvard only controls 9% of the endowment. The dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences controls 60%. So who's the right address to get things done? Both is the right answer, but how? So there's one. There's many other pictures we'll share, but really how to kind of understand the social and institutional world that is Harvard. And then the second piece, which has come up again and again on this call, which I'm so happy for, which is the pluralism of the Jewish community, the inclusion and support of different types of students, um, and the work we do there, and laying out some of the theory, especially, and some of the practice, especially when it gets hard. I want to just conclude here in our last minute before 9:30. It's been incredible to see hundreds of you on this call. We are committed to supporting you, to engaging you, to helping you find ways you can support the Jewish community. Bringing the Jewish community together has never been harder. It's never been more important. And there's never been a time when so many of us have felt very, very deeply that we need to secure a Jewish future for our children and grandchildren, and the next generation of Jews who will come after us in the ways that those who came before us did as well. And so I want to thank you for being part of this community tonight, for your constant engagement, and especially for building up a community of trust and respect and decency. This recording will be available. Our staff are available for questions, and we will see this through together as 100 generations of our ancestors have. And we will make those who come after us proud to be working in the tradition that we inherited and which we're so grateful for. Have a good night. And for those of you who I don't see in the next 5 weeks, Shana Tova, may you and those you love be inscribed for only goodness and blessing, all of us, the Jewish people, the hostages and their families, in this new year. Be well and have a good night.